The grocery store buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a quiet afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood. Shoppers moved through the aisles, some lost in thought, others exchanging friendly greetings with familiar faces. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the crisp chill of the refrigerated sections, and the gentle hum of conversations and beeping cash registers filled the air. It was the kind of day where nothing extraordinary was expected, just another routine trip to the store. But sometimes, the most unexpected moments change everything. Near the produce section, an elderly woman stood adjusting her glasses, her expression one of mild impatience as she reached for a bag of apples. She appeared to be in her late 70s, her silver hair neatly pinned in place, her faded cardigan buttoned up despite the warmth of the store. There was a careful precision to her movements, the way she examined each apple before placing them into her cart, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. A few feet away, a young man named Daryl strolled through the aisle, balancing his grocery basket in one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. He was tall, dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, his demeanor relaxed, blending effortlessly into the flow of the store. To anyone watching, he was just another shopper going about his business, no different from anyone else. He reached for a bag of oranges, his fingers just brushing against the plastic, when he heard it. "You people don't belong here." The words were spoken loudly enough for those nearby to hear, cutting through the soft murmur of the store like a sharp blade. Daryl froze, his fingers hovering over the oranges as his mind processed what he had just heard. Slowly, he looked up, his eyes meeting the stern gaze of the elderly woman. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her expression unwavering. There was no hesitation, no hint of regret in her eyes. If anything, she looked as if she expected him to react, to lash out, to argue. But he didn't. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" she continued, her voice sharper this time, carrying an edge that made the silence around them even heavier. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The woman near the bread aisle, who had been browsing the shelves, suddenly went still, her fingers clutching a loaf of whole wheat. A young mother, holding her child's hand, turned and quickly steered him in the opposite direction. An older man near the potatoes, who had just been reaching for a bag, hesitated, his eyes darting between Daryl and the elderly woman, unsure of what to do. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fill the air, it pressed down on everyone in the room, making it impossible to ignore. Daryl's initial reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, his grip on his grocery basket tightening as a dozen possible responses raced through his mind. He could fire back with anger, demand to know who she thought she was. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't heard it, let the moment pass like so many others before it. But instead, he took a breath. A slow, deliberate breath. His expression remained unreadable, his posture steady. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. Even the young employee stacking bananas a few feet away had stopped, frozen in mid-motion, his gaze locked on the unfolding scene. The elderly woman, still clutching her apples, held her ground, her chin lifted slightly, her stance unwavering. It was as if she was daring him to respond, as if she expected anger or a sharp retort. But Daryl didn't give her what she expected. Instead, he shifted his basket to his other hand, straightened his shoulders, and let the pause stretch between them, long enough for her words to settle into the ears of everyone who had heard them. Then, in a voice that was calm but deliberate, he finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" As Daryl reached for a bag of oranges, he felt a shift in the air, something almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. It was the kind of shift that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the feeling of being watched, scrutinized. He didn't notice her at first. He was focused on his groceries, minding his own business. But the moment he stepped closer to the fruit stand, the elderly woman turned sharply toward him. Her expression hardened. Her eyes narrowed as she took him in, his height, his skin, his presence in a space she clearly believed he didn't belong. There was no mistaking the look on her face. It wasn't simple irritation or impatience, it was something deeper, something colder. And then she spoke. "You people don't belong here." The words sliced through the comfortable hum of the store, loud enough for those nearby to hear, deliberate enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. Daryl's fingers stopped inches from the oranges. For a second, his brain struggled to register what had just happened, as if his mind refused to believe the words had been spoken out loud, in public, in broad daylight. But before he could react, the woman spoke again, this time with even more bite. Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the normal sounds of the grocery store like a sudden clap of thunder. The casual murmur of shoppers moving through the aisles faded. A mother, who had been holding her child's hand, stiffened and quickly turned away, leading her son in the opposite direction. A man near the potatoes, who had been casually examining a bag of russets, stopped mid-motion, his fingers frozen around the plastic. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Darryl blinked, his muscles tensing involuntarily. His grip tightened around the handle of his grocery basket, and for a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. His mind raced through 100 different reactions at once: shock, disbelief, anger. Part of him wanted to respond immediately, to say something, anything, to shut her down. Another part of him wanted to simply walk away, to pretend he hadn't heard, to not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But he knew deep down that this was a moment that couldn't just be ignored. He lifted his gaze to the woman, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. She didn't look away. She stood firm, chin slightly lifted, as if daring him to say something back. Around them, the store seemed to hold its breath. Some people looked down at their carts, suddenly very interested in their groceries, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Others, though, lingered. A young woman near the bakery section had stopped entirely, her gaze locked on the scene unfolding before her. A cashier, who had been ringing up a customer a few aisles away, craned her neck slightly, trying to see what was happening. A young employee stacking bananas a few feet away hesitated, unsure if he should intervene or simply stay out of it. Darryl's heartbeat was steady but strong, pounding in his ears. This wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce his existence to a misplaced presence, to an outsider in a place where he had every right to be. But what mattered now wasn't just how he felt. It was how he chose to respond. Darryl didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't allow the heat of the moment to dictate his response. Instead, he took a slow breath, steadying himself, letting the tension in the air settle around him without letting it take hold of him. He looked at the elderly woman, not with anger, not with immediate outrage, but with something deeper, something thoughtful measured. His gaze was unwavering, as if he was searching for something beneath her hardened expression, some trace of understanding, some opening for reason. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a challenge. It was a question, a real one. An invitation, however small, for her to reflect. But she had no interest in reflection. "I said what I meant," she snapped. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Her chin lifted defiantly, her grip tightening on the apples in her cart as if bracing herself for an argument. There was no hesitation in her words, no doubt in her voice. She wasn't looking for a debate. She wasn't looking to be convinced otherwise. She believed she was right. Darryl studied her for a long moment. He could feel the weight of the silence around them, the quiet anticipation of those who had stopped to witness this exchange. The young woman near the bread aisle, the cashier at her register, the man near the potatoes, they were all waiting, watching. He could have walked away. He could have dismissed her as just another bitter voice in a long history of bitter voices. But something in him refused to let this moment pass unnoticed, to let her words settle into the air without challenge. So he did the opposite of what she expected. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. Instead, he set his grocery basket down on the floor with deliberate care, straightened his posture, and allowed the silence to stretch just a little longer. His presence grew larger, not because he raised his voice, but because of the way he carried himself, steady, unshaken, unmovable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but strong, carrying the weight of generations. "You said I don't belong here," he began, each word deliberate. "That I should go back to Africa. But let me tell you something about where I come from." The grocery store was no longer just a place of errands and routine. It had become a stage, a moment suspended in time, a place where truth would be spoken. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," Darryl continued, his voice unwavering. "He was a sharecropper. He worked land he didn't own, breaking his back every day so his children might have a chance at something better." A hush fell over the crowd. His father, Darryl went on, wasn't given a choice. He was kidnapped, stolen, shackled and sold like cattle, treated as less than human. And yet, despite everything, despite the beatings, the chains, the suffering, he survived. He survived to help build the very country you're standing in right now. A man near the dairy section shifted uncomfortably. A woman, who had been pretending to examine a bag of bread, no longer even held it. Daryl's words settled into the air like heavy stones, impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend away. My grandfather, he continued, his voice growing stronger, fought in World War II. He risked his life for this country that sent him overseas to fight, only to treat him like a second-class citizen when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? No one spoke. No one even breathed. Because he believed in this country's promise, Daryl said, his eyes locked onto the elderly woman's, his voice filled with something deeper than anger, something stronger than hate, even when it didn't believe in him. The old woman's lips pressed together. She didn't speak. But something in her posture shifted, just slightly. My parents, Daryl continued, his voice quieter now but no less powerful, they fought too. Not with guns. Not with fists. But with hard work. My mother is a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids of every race, every background, because she believes in the power of knowledge. My father is a mechanic. He's the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down. His words lingered in the space between them, stretching out over the quiet, over the tension that now felt different, less like confrontation, more like realization. So tell me, he said finally, you still think I don't belong here? The store had never been this silent. Every sound, the distant beeping of a checkout scanner, the quiet whir of refrigerators, the faint rustle of shopping bags, seemed to fade into the background. The usual rhythm of the grocery store had come to a halt, replaced by something heavier, something that filled every inch of space with quiet intensity. A man near the frozen food section, who had been scrolling through his phone moments ago, lowered it without realizing he had done so. His fingers hovered over the screen, forgotten. An elderly couple near the dairy aisle whispered to one another, their expressions tight, their eyes never leaving Daryl. A young mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter, her gaze flickering between him and the woman before him. Daryl could feel them all, watching, waiting. But he wasn't speaking for them. He wasn't performing. He was simply telling the truth. My grandfather, he continued, his voice steady but growing stronger, fought in World War II. He risked his life for this country, just like thousands of other young men. The woman said nothing, but her grip on her shopping cart tightened. But when he came home, Daryl went on, he wasn't treated like a hero. He couldn't eat at certain restaurants. He couldn't drink from certain fountains. He wore the same uniform as other soldiers, fought under the same flag, but when he stepped back onto American soil, he was still seen as less than. A young cashier near the front of the store stopped mid-scan, her eyes locked on Daryl. A man who had been standing near a shelf of canned goods turned slightly, as if drawn in despite himself. Daryl's voice didn't waver. My father, he said, he's a mechanic. The kind of man who will pull over to help a stranger with a broken-down car, no matter who they are. My mother is a teacher. She spent her life helping kids of every race, every background, because she believes that knowledge is power. That people can change. His eyes met the elderly woman's once again. She was stiff, unmoving, but something in her face had changed. The certainty, the defiance that had been there before, had started to crack. You said I don't belong here, Daryl said, his tone quiet but unwavering. That I should go back to Africa. She pressed her lips together, but still, she did not speak. But let me ask you something, he continued. Who really belongs here? The silence around them deepened, every person in that store hanging on his words. My family has shed blood, sweat, and tears for this country, he said. They've sacrificed for it. They've built it. They've fought for it, even when it didn't fight for them. So tell me, ma'am, what have you done to claim more right to it than me? The woman's face paled. Her fingers clenched around the apples in her cart as if they were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked uncertain. For the first time, she looked shaken. And for the first time, she had nothing to say. The silence held for a moment longer, heavy and unmoving, stretching over the store like an invisible weight. No one dared to break it, until finally someone did. A man near the produce section, wearing a worn baseball cap, shifted his weight and stepped forward. His face was lined with years of experience, his eyes thoughtful as he looked from Darryl to the elderly woman. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unshaken. "He's right," the man said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We have to be better than this." It was just a few words. Simple. Clear. But they carried weight. Somewhere near the bakery, an older woman nodded, her gaze distant, lost in thought. She spoke up, her voice softer but just as sure. "My father fought in that same war," she said. "And you know what he always told me? He said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." A ripple went through the crowd. More people began to nod, to murmur in agreement. Then, as if a collective decision had been made, someone clapped. It was slow at first, hesitant, uncertain. But then another person joined in. And another. Until suddenly, the store was filled with the sound of applause, a rolling wave of support that grew louder with each second. It wasn't just for Darryl. It was for the truth he had spoken, for the dignity with which he had handled the moment, for the reminder that words could be powerful, that they could cut deep, but that they could also heal. Near the checkout lanes, a young cashier barely in her 20s called out from behind her register, shaking her head in disbelief. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace," she said. "That was incredible." Darryl didn't bask in the applause. He didn't smile in triumph. He simply stood there, calm, composed, watching the woman before him. She was still gripping her cart, her knuckles white, her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak. But nothing came out. For the first time, she looked uncertain. For the first time, she looked small. She swallowed, her throat working as if forcing down words she couldn't bring herself to say. Her gaze darted around the store, searching for something, an ally, maybe, someone who would agree with her, someone who would stand by her side. But no one did. She was alone in her convictions now. And maybe, for the first time, she realized it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she finally looked back at Darryl. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean," she started, but the words trailed off, lost before they could find form. Darryl's expression softened. He shook his head slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not about what you meant," he said. "It's about how it came across." She blinked at him, unsure. "Words matter," he continued. "Actions matter even more." She looked down at her cart, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the handle. She nodded once, but it was barely noticeable. Then, without another word, she turned her cart and walked away. The applause died down as people watched her go, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. The moment was over, but something about it lingered, settling into the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. A woman stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on Darryl's shoulder. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. "Thank you," she murmured, "for saying what needed to be said." Darryl nodded, lifting his basket back into his hands. Sometimes, he thought to himself, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure the truth was heard. The moment lingered, stretching far beyond the last echoes of applause. A single clap had started it, hesitant but resolute, and then the store had erupted with the sound of hands coming together, not out of spectacle, not out of obligation, but out of something real. Agreement. Understanding. Respect. Darryl didn't need to look around to know that something had shifted. He could feel it in the air. The weight that had once pressed down on the room had changed, softened, lifted just enough for people to breathe again. The elderly woman stood frozen for a beat longer, gripping the handle of her cart, her fingers tense, knuckles pale. There was no fire in her eyes now, no defiant lift of her chin. Instead, her gaze flickered downward, somewhere distant, somewhere inward. She said nothing. She turned, slowly, and wheeled her cart toward the exit. The sound of the store moving again, of footsteps and soft conversations, followed her as she walked away. But for those who had been watching, truly watching, it was clear that she wasn't leaving unchanged. Darryl let out a breath, deep and steady. The confrontation had ended, but its impact remained, settled into the quiet spaces of every person who had witnessed it. A woman approached him, her expression warm but serious. She reached out, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. Her voice was soft, but there was strength in it. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what needed to be said." Darryl met her gaze, offering a small knowing smile. "Sometimes," he replied, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure the truth is heard." He gathered his groceries, nodding at the few people who caught his eye, some offering silent nods of respect, some murmuring words of support. The young cashier from earlier was still watching him, her admiration evident, her eyes filled with something close to hope. As Darryl stepped out into the cool evening air, the golden light of the setting sun stretching long shadows across the parking lot, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Not heavy, not burdensome, just present. Near the far end of the lot, he noticed her. The elderly woman sat behind the wheel of her car, unmoving, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at anything, really, just staring ahead, her posture rigid, her lips pressed together. Darryl considered going to her, saying something, finishing whatever had been left unfinished. But he didn't. Some lessons take time to settle. Some realizations don't happen in the moment, but in the quiet that follows. That night, as Darryl sat at the kitchen table with his father, he recounted the events of the day. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, nodding slowly as his son spoke. When Darryl finished, his father folded his hands, his voice thoughtful. "You did the right thing, son," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching." Darryl nodded, his father's words settling deep within him. Across town, in a dimly lit dining room, the elderly woman sat alone at her table. A plate of food rested before her, untouched. The weight of the day sat heavy in her chest, pressing against the beliefs she had carried for so long. Darryl's words echoed in her mind. "Not about what you meant. About how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." She looked down at her hands, tracing the lines of her fingers, the creases of her knuckles. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in. And for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong. In the days that followed, the story spread through the neighborhood, not as gossip, but as a conversation. People spoke of Darryl's response, of his composure, of the quiet but undeniable power of his words. They spoke of the way the air had changed in that store, the way people had listened, really listened. Darryl hadn't sought attention for what had happened. He hadn't needed to. The moment had spoken for itself. Strangers approached him in the days that followed, sharing their own stories, their own experiences of prejudice and resilience. People who had never spoken about such things before found themselves opening up, reflecting, questioning. Even the elderly woman, though she never sought him out again, had changed in ways she could not yet name. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't easy. But something had shifted inside her. And perhaps if she ever saw Darryl again, she would find the courage to say what she couldn't that day. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, of strength, of truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes, it means speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. Because in the end, we all have a choice. Words can hurt, or they can heal. They can divide, or they can unite. Be the person who chooses to heal. If this story moved you, share it. Let it be a reminder that change starts with a voice. And that voice can be yours. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away, take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.